Hello. Today we're going to go over 1.7 Day 1 notes, which are all about absolute value equations. So the definition of absolute value is a number's distance from zero on a number line. So with distance, you're never going to say that I went a negative distance. So if I walked 10 feet in front of me, I've walked 10 feet. But if I walked 10 feet backwards, the amount I've still traveled is still 10 feet. So absolute value is going to always give you a positive answer. So it's always going to be positive. So if you're looking at -3 and 0, these have a distance of 3 away. Even though it's a -3 to 0, you're not going like -3 distance, it's 3 away. So that's the idea with absolute value. And what we can do is we can go ahead and evaluate things that have absolute values in them. So looking at number 1A, with these ones, anytime it tells you to simplify and it's just numbers here, you always want to follow the order of operations. So the order of operations, parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division from left to right, and addition, subtraction from left to right. Now, when people say parentheses, they a lot of times now are going to say grouping instead of parentheses, because we don't just use parentheses as grouping. In fact, absolute value is a grouping symbol. So we have to simplify everything inside of the absolute value first, and then take the absolute value. A good example of this is A. So we have this grouping symbol of the absolute value. So we actually want to simplify everything inside of it first. So -14 plus 7 is going to be -7. So we've simplified the absolute value. And so what we can do then is we can also do 2 times 6. That's another grouping thing there to get 12. Now the number out in front of the absolute value, this 2 here, is being multiplied by the absolute value of -7. So what we need to do here is we're going to do 2 times, and then we need to take the absolute value of -7. So how far is -7 from 0 on the number line? Well, it's going to be a total of 7 units away. So the absolute value becomes positive now. 2 times 7 is 14, and then plus 12 gives us 26 in total. For part B, we're going to take and look at all these absolute values because they're grouping symbols. So for this first one, the absolute value of -12, there's nothing to simplify there, so we just turn it to positive 12. The absolute value of 54 is still just going to be 54. And we can't do anything inside, or we can't take the absolute value yet. Rather, we have to multiply first. So we're going to do -3 times 4 to get -12. And you can't distribute into an absolute value. That's a big mistake that happens. So don't distribute into. Instead, take the absolute value. So the absolute value of -12 is positive 12. And then we can kind of start simplifying some things in front here. 12 divided by 6 is 2. 54 divided by 9 is 6. And we still have this minus sign. And then adding and subtracting, you're going to go left to right. So 2 minus 6 is -4. And -4 minus 12 makes it a -16 in total. So that's how you simplify with absolute values. So now what we're going to do is we're going to start solving equations that involve those absolute values. So 2A says graph all of the numbers that are 3 units away from 0 on the number line. So if this is 0, what I'm going to go is 1, 2, 3, and I'm going to plot that point right there. That's over at 3. So 3 is 3 units away from 0. But that's not the only one. If I go 1, 2, 3 in the left direction, over here is 3 units away from 0 as well. That's going to be -3. So with the absolute value of x equals 3, what that is saying is x here could be 3 because 3 is a distance of 3 from 0 on the number line. But if we were to plug in -3 into our absolute value, because we're looking at the distance between -3 and 0 on the number line is also 3. So absolute value equations, when we're solving them, they're going to actually give us 2 different answers. one for the positive distance, and then one for the negative direction. So in order to solve absolute value equations, there's kind of a process we need to follow. The first part is you have to get the absolute value alone. You have to do that first. Get the absolute value alone. So for instance, 3a, you notice I have the absolute value of x, and then I have the plus 2 on that side. What I'm going to do is I'm going to move the 2 to the other side so that on the right-hand side, I just have the absolute value of x. So 7 minus 2 then is 5. So that's part 1, get the absolute value alone. Part 2, what you're going to do is you're going to set up two equations. Set up two equations. So the absolute value of x is going to equal some number at this stage because you got the absolute value alone. What you're going to do is you're going to break this up, and the first one you're just going to write whatever's inside equals the number. So x equals that number. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to leave what's inside alone, so it's just x in this case, equals, and then we're going to negate. Okay, so it's, I shouldn't write 3. It could be any number. I just stole the example from the last one. So you're going to write x equals that positive number and x equals that negative number. So in example 3 over here, we're going to break this up. We're going to leave x equals in both of our equations, and the number it equals is either 5 or negative 5. Now, sometimes when you set up your two equations, you're not done yet. You might have to solve each equation. So if in the absolute value you had x minus 1, you would have to have like x minus 1 equals 5 and x minus 1 equals negative 5. You'd have to solve each of those equations. So I'm going to zoom out. This one doesn't have anything to solve. So we have one final step. And our final step here is going to be to check your answer. Sometimes we get answers that we think should work, but when we plug them back in, they don't work. Okay, so we have to check your answer. Answers that should work but don't are called extraneous solutions because they're extra. We think they should have worked, but they actually don't. So let's go ahead and check this one. If we were to plug 5 into our original equation, so we're plugging 5 in for x, we would get 7 equals the absolute value of 5 plus 2. Now the absolute value of 5 is 5, so 5 plus 2 gives us 7. So for the next one, 7 equals the absolute value of negative 5 plus 2. Well, the absolute value of negative 5 is positive 5, so that one works out as well. So both of our answers work. So we're going to write them in our solution set. For this one, you can just do your bracket, and then we're going to go least to greatest, negative 5 and positive 5. Those were our two answers. So that's what we write in our solution set. So let's take a look at a bunch of different scenarios that might come up. So for part B, again, step by step, step 1 is to get the absolute value alone, and that's done. Step 2 is to break this up into two separate equations. So for this one, we have 2x minus 3. That's not going to change. So for each of these equations, you're going to write 2x minus 3. Whatever it equals, that's the one you're going to change. So we're going to leave one as positive 1 and then one as negative 1. So again, leave what's inside alone, and what it equals, that's what you're going to make one positive and one negative. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to solve each equation. And so our first one gives us x equals 2. And our next one we get x equals 1. Before we write about these, though, we're just going to do a quick check. We're going to plug them back in here to see if they work. And honestly, I don't really need to see you showing this step. I just need you to mentally do it. So 2 times 2 minus 3 is 1, and the absolute value of 1 is 1. So that one works. 2 times 1 minus 3 is negative 1, the absolute value of which is positive 1, so that one also works. So we get our two solutions of x equals 1 and x equals 2. So for the next one, we have to do that first step. This absolute value has to be by itself. So we're going to go ahead and move the 8 to the other side. And then we're going to go ahead and divide by 3. Here's a crucial part. You can never distribute into an absolute value. So never distribute into an absolute value. Instead, you have to solve for it a different way. So we divided by 3. Now what we're going to do is we're going to set up our two equations. So x plus 6 equals -1, and x plus 6 equals +1. We're going to solve our equations to get x equals -7 and x equals -5. So this one's a little bit lengthier to check, so I'm going to show it just a little bit. So I'm plugging in -7 for x. So I do -7 plus 6, that's -1. The absolute value of -1 is a +1. And 3 times 1 plus 8 does not actually equal 5. This is one of those where this answer is supposed to work, but it doesn't. So now let's test x equals -5. Same process. We're going to go ahead and simplify and see if we get a true statement. The absolute value of 1 is 1. 3 plus 8, once again, does not equal 5. So that answer does not work either. Nothing is going to end up working. This is going to have no solution. There's no value of x that will make this true. So let's go ahead and try now D and E. So we have to get the absolute value alone first. Then we're going to break this up into two equations. X plus 5 equals 2, and x plus 5 equals -2. Oops, I switched those. Then we're going to go ahead and solve to get x equals -3 and x equals -7. So if you want to, go ahead and pause and check your solutions on your own. Both of these solutions ended up working out, so you get x equals -3 and -7. For part E, we have to get the absolute value alone first. Here, I'm subtracting 2. Word of caution here, do not do 2 minus 3. We cannot combine those together because the 3 has strings attached. The 3 is actually attached to the absolute value. So we have to move the 2 over instead of actually subtracting them. Then we're going to divide by a -3 because we cannot distribute into an absolute value. And then we go ahead and we set up two equations. X minus 2 equals 4, and x minus 2 equals -4. We solve each equation, and we plug those back in, and those end up working. So we get -2 and +6. So here's what I'd like you to do. Pause the video, try the next two examples, and then come back and you can check your work. Okay, so once again, we should have tried these two examples first, and now we can kind of look at over the work here. So for part F, we got the absolute value alone by subtracting 3. We broke up our two equations to equal positive and -2. We solved each equation to get 2 and 4. And when you plug these back in, both of these end up actually not working out. So you get untrue statements. So this is another example where this is no solution. For F, taking a look at that one, we notice we subtracted 5 and divided by -2 to get the absolute value alone. We broke up our two equations and solved, and the solving was a little bit more intense for that one, and we ended up with two fractions. When you check your answers for those, they both end up working. So we get -11/2 and 17/2 as our two solutions. So hopefully this went okay. Feel free to let me know if you have questions and we can go over it together. Thank you very much for listening.